The joke that almost killed Jimi Hendrix's career began with a single nervous laugh backstage at the Sands Hotel in 1968. Las Vegas stretched before him like a glittering alien planet, all sequins and showmanship, a world where every performance was polished to diamond perfection. Jimi stood in his velvet jacket and wild halo of hair, feeling the weight of eyes, measuring him against this kingdom of entertainment royalty. This wasn't London or San Francisco, where his star had exploded. This was Vegas, and here one man ruled absolutely. Sammy Davis Jr. owned this town in ways Jimi was only beginning to understand. The casino floors whispered his name like a prayer. His face smiled from every marquee, and his dressing room sat at the end of the hallway like a throne room awaiting its king. Jimi had conquered Monterey, set guitars ablaze in front of screaming crowds, but walking these polished marble corridors felt like trespassing in a cathedral where he didn't know the hymns. The air smelled of expensive cigars and older money, the kind that didn't care about feedback or distortion. He watched sharply dressed executives glide past, their conversations falling silent when they noticed him. The wild-eyed guitar player from Seattle who'd learned his craft in the Chitlin circuit before conquering England. Here in Las Vegas, Jimi Hendrix was the outsider, pressing his face against the window of American entertainment royalty. The industry executives gathered in tight circles backstage, their conversations humming with the electric anticipation that precedes something memorable. Jimi found himself surrounded by these men in impeccable suits, their questions polite but probing, their smiles not quite reaching their calculating eyes. His nerves buzzed like amplifier feedback, and before his brain could catch up with his mouth, the words tumbled out. A joke, really, just nervous energy seeking release. "Maybe Sammy and I should settle who's really got the touch, you know, a guitar duel or something," he said, with a laugh that sounded hollow even. To his own ears, the temperature in the hallway dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips, and every face turned toward him with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed horror. Jimi felt his stomach twist as he realized he'd crossed some invisible line, challenged a man who'd fought his way through color barriers and death threats to become the first black performer to sleep in the hotels where he entertained. These executives knew what Jimi was only beginning to grasp. Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't just an entertainer, he was a monument. Then, cutting through the suffocating silence, came the click of expensive leather shoes on marble. Sammy emerged from his dressing room, compact and powerful in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, moving with that dancer's grace that made every gesture look choreographed by destiny itself. His one good eye fixed on Jimi with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through pretense and bravado, reading the young guitarist's soul like sheet music. "Tomorrow night, the Flamingo Midnight," Sammy said quietly, his smile mysterious as smoke. And something in that moment felt less like acceptance and more like initiation into mysteries Jimi didn't yet comprehend. The news spread through Las Vegas like desert wind through canyon rock, carried on the lips of cocktail waitresses and casino dealers, whispered between card tables and shouted across crap games. By sunrise, every showroom, every lounge, every smoky backroom where deals were made knew the impossible was happening. Sammy Davis Jr., the man who'd transformed himself from vaudeville child into the most complete entertainer America had ever produced, would share a stage with rock and roll's wild prophet. This wasn't mere entertainment, this was history declaring itself, 2 generations of black excellence preparing to speak in the only language that mattered, the universal truth of music that needed no translation. Phone lines burned hot as journalists called editors, as celebrities cancelled flights, as Vegas royalty cashed in favors for tickets that didn't technically exist yet. Frank called Dean, Dean called Joey, and suddenly the entire Rat Pack was clearing schedules, because when Sammy stepped into something, you showed up, or you missed witnessing greatness. The Flamingo's manager fielded calls from movie stars and Senators, from musicians who'd shaped American sound, all of them desperate to witness what felt less like competition and more like communion. Sammy moved through his day with characteristic precision, rehearsing his regular show while his mind played different music entirely. He'd spent decades proving that excellence was the only answer to hatred, that perfection was both shield and sword against a world that wanted to diminish him. Tomorrow night wasn't about defending territory. It was about extending his hand across a generational divide, showing this brilliant young maverick that the spotlight was large enough for revolution to meet tradition. By midnight, Vegas understood what Jimmy was still learning. Sammy Davis Jr. didn't accept challenges. He created monuments. The hotel room felt smaller with each passing hour, walls pressing inward as Jimmy sat with his Stratocaster across his lap, fingers moving without sound across strings he couldn't bring himself to amplify. What had possessed him to challenge a man who'd survived what no one should have to survive, who'd walked through doors that didn't want to open, whose very presence in these casinos represented battles fought in blood and dignity? The joke that seemed so clever yesterday now tasted like ash, like disrespect wrapped in arrogance, and sleep refused to come as he replayed that moment when the room went silent and Sammy's eyes held something he couldn't quite read. He thought about the stories he'd heard, fragments of truth about a man who'd lost an eye and gained prophecy, who'd faced down Vegas itself when the same hotels that showcased his brilliance wouldn't let him sleep in their beds or swim in their pools. Sammy hadn't demanded. He'd transcended, turned excellence into an argument that couldn't be refuted, made his talent so undeniable that hatred had to step aside or admit its own smallness. And now here was Jimi Hendrix, wild child of the new sound, treating that legacy like some casual bar bet. Dawn found him standing at his window, watching neon surrender to sunlight, wondering if he should apologize, if he should cancel, if his electric rebellion looked childish next to decades of dignified revolution. But something deeper whispered that maybe Sammy had accepted for a reason, that perhaps this wasn't about competition at all, but about something larger, about torches being passed and generations speaking across divides that only music could bridge. The Flamingo's showroom had become something beyond a venue, transformed into a coliseum where history held its breath and every seat carried the weight of witness. They came in waves that overwhelmed capacity, movie stars pressing against music royalty, high rollers abandoning roulette wheels, mobsters in silk suits standing shoulder to shoulder with jazz legends who'd traveled through the night just to say they were there. Frank Sinatra sat front row with Dean Martin, both men wearing expressions that mixed amusement with genuine curiosity, while behind them, the room stretched into standing room chaos, bodies packed so tight the air itself seemed to sweat anticipation. The lights held a strange quality, softer than concert glare, but more focused than lounge ambiance, casting shadows that made the stage look like hallowed ground. Conversations rippled through the crowd in whispered speculation, some claiming this was publicity genius, others insisting genuine conflict brewed beneath the surface. But everyone understanding they stood at some unmarked intersection where old guards met new revolutions. The casino floor beyond had gone nearly empty, dealers standing idle as all of Vegas's beating heart relocated to this single room, this singular moment. Backstage, someone dropped a glass and the crash echoed like a starting pistol. Nobody fired. The house band tuned instruments with extra precision, each musician aware they might be accompanying something unrepeatable, while stage managers checked microphone levels 3 times over, as if perfection might prevent catastrophe. Every face in that packed room pointed toward the curtain with the same unspoken question burning behind their eyes. Then the lights shifted, conversation died mid-syllable, and the curtain whispered open to reveal Sammy Davis Jr. standing alone with a guitar, his single eye somehow seeing everyone at once. Sammy stepped into the spotlight wearing humility like a tailored suit. the guitar cradling against his body as if they'd grown. Together through decades of empty rooms and hostile crowds. He didn't announce himself or play to the cameras. He simply closed his eye and began, fingers finding notes that spoke in his father's vaudeville voice, in his mother's church hymns, in every locked dressing room and whites-only entrance. He'd transformed through sheer excellence. The melody emerged not as performance, but as testimony, each phrase carrying the weight of a man who'd tap-danced while they threw racial slurs, who'd smiled through death threats to become royalty in a town built on exclusion. The technical precision arrived wrapped in soul that made technique irrelevant, jazz runs that would make session players weep, flowed into blues bends that held centuries of pain and triumph. His right hand danced patterns so complex they seemed impossible for human fingers, yet every note landed with emotional truth that bypassed the brain and struck directly at the heart. Frank leaned forward. Dean's smile faded into something like reverence, and throughout that packed room, grown men found tears on their faces without understanding why. Backstage, Jimmy stood frozen in the wings, his confidence crumbling like ancient walls before floodwaters. This wasn't showmanship or competition. This was a master class in everything the guitar could become when wielded by someone who'd used music as both weapon and bridge. The final notes hung suspended in air, thick with history, and when Sammy opened his eye, he looked directly at Jimmy with an expression that said, "Your turn, young brother. Show them what we're becoming." Jimmy walked onto that stage carrying the weight of his own legend, the Stratocaster hanging from his shoulders like a weapon forged in electric fire. He didn't speak. Words felt useless after what Sammy had just revealed. He simply unleashed himself into the opening assault, fingers attacking strings with violence that somehow transformed into beauty. The raw power that had made him infamous exploded through amplifiers pushed past their limits, feedback screaming like prophecy as he bent notes into shapes that shouldn't exist in nature. But halfway through, as he leaned into a passage that would have torn the roof off any other venue, disaster struck. The leather strap gave way with a snap that echoed through the sudden silence. The guitar swung downward, momentum pulling it toward the floor as Jimmy lunged desperately to catch it, his body twisting in mid-performance like a man watching his dreams shatter in slow motion. The audience gasped collectively. Frank half rose from his seat, and for one terrible heartbeat, the entire spectacle threatened to collapse into humiliation. Every eye watched this young revolutionary frozen between greatness and catastrophe, his hands clutching the neck while the body dangled uselessly, strings still vibrating with the ghost of interrupted genius. Time stretched cruel and thin, exposing vulnerability that no amount of talent could armor against. Then movement from stage left. Sammy already walking forward with purpose written in every step, no hesitation, no judgment in that weathered face. He carried his custom guitar like an offering, the same instrument that had survived vaudeville circuits and Vegas prejudice, extending it toward Jimmy with hands that understood exactly what this moment meant. Their eyes met across 3 feet that contained generations, and something passed between them that rendered competition meaningless. This was brotherhood forged in the fire that consumed men who dared to be extraordinary while black. Jimmy's fingers wrapped around the neck of Sammy's guitar, feeling the worn grooves where countless performances had left their ghost impressions in the wood. The weight felt different, more substantial, not just maple and mahogany, but history itself. Generations of struggle, compressed into lacquered curves that had witnessed every humiliation Sammy endured to claim his throne. Their hands touched briefly during the exchange, calloused palm against calloused palm, and in that contact passed an understanding that transcended the competitive fire that brought them here. Sammy's eyes held no triumph, no pity, only recognition that this young wild man bleeding revolution through his fingertips was fighting the same war on different terrain. "Show them what we are," Sammy said quietly. Words meant only for Jimi, his voice carrying the gravel of 1,000 stages, where he'd transformed hatred into standing ovations through sheer excellence. He stepped back but didn't leave, remaining stage right, like a guardian presence, his body language declaring to everyone watching that this wasn't surrender, but solidarity. The showroom held its breath as Jimi adjusted the strap, testing strings that had absorbed Sammy's sweat and dreams, feeling how the instrument had been loved into. Submission by hands that understood performance as survival. Something shifted in his chest. This wasn't about proving superiority anymore. When Jimi struck the first chord on Sammy's guitar, the sound emerged different, warmer somehow, carrying undertones of jazz clubs and vaudeville circuits woven into his psychedelic fury. He looked across at Sammy and nodded once, an invitation that shattered the duel's original premise, and watched the older man's face transform with surprised joy. Together they leaned into improvisation, two revolutionaries speaking the same language through different dialects, their combined sound creating something the segregated world had tried desperately to prevent. The music became conversation, argument, laughter, and prayer, black excellence in dialogue with itself. The music spiraled upward, climbing through octaves where technique dissolved into pure feeling, each man pushing the other toward territories neither had explored alone. Sammy's jazz sophistication braided through Jimi's cosmic fury, creating phrases that sounded like Duke Ellington, jamming in Harlem, while simultaneously exploding on Mars. His fingers danced across frets with the precision earned through decades when being twice as good was the only path to half the recognition, every note a declaration that excellence could not be denied. Sweat flew from both men as the tempo accelerated, their bodies moving in unconscious sync, generations of black genius finally allowed to speak without translating themselves for white comfort. Dean Martin leaned toward Frank and whispered something that made the chairman nod slowly, his usual cool facade cracking into genuine awe. In the wings, dancers and dealers, showgirls and pit. Bosses stood shoulder to shoulder, transfixed by communion happening between these titans. The mobsters who controlled Vegas real estate found themselves irrelevant, their power meaningless against this sovereignty of sound. Even the casino floor outside fell quiet, gamblers abandoning their tables to press against doorways drawn by something their money could never purchase. The jam stretched past 10 minutes, then 15, then 20, time becoming elastic under the weight of what was being forged on stage. Sammy threw back his head, grinning with pure liberation, playing with a freedom he'd rarely allowed himself in rooms that demanded he stay palatable. Jimi matched his joy, understanding finally what it meant to have an elder who saw him completely, who'd survived the wars. Jimi was still fighting. Their final chord rang out simultaneously, neither leading nor following, just arriving together at the same inevitable conclusion. The audience erupted into chaos, celebrities on their feet, strangers embracing. 10 minutes of applause that felt like vindication for every closed door and crossed-out name. The interview came decades after that legendary night, Sammy's face carved with years of triumph and exhaustion, his one eye gleaming with tears as he held the worn guitar in trembling hands. "This was my father's," he told the hushed studio audience, his voice breaking with reverence that made grown men lean forward. He played this in vaudeville houses, where they'd make him enter through the kitchen, where excellence was our only weapon against erasure. The camera caught him running fingers across strings that had absorbed 3 generations of defiance, and suddenly the duel wasn't about competition. It was about inheritance. He explained how that night at the Flamingo, watching Jimi's strap break, he saw every broken promise this country had made to black genius. Every stage denied, every door slammed. "I gave him what my father gave me. Permission to be extraordinary without apology, to take up space, to burn so bright they couldn't look away." His words carried the weight of tap dancing until his feet bled to get through doors Jimi could kick down with amplified fury. Two different strategies, same war for recognition, for humanity, for the right to create on their own terms. The guitar became a symbol displayed in the Smithsonian, its wood grain holding conversations between vaudeville and Woodstock, Vegas showrooms, and psychedelic revolution. Sammy's legacy crystallized in that moment of generosity when competition transformed into consecration, when an elder blessed the young revolutionary with ancestral power. He'd survived by being palatable until the moment arrived to anoint someone who refused palatability entirely, ensuring the torch burned brighter as it passed forward through time. Years after both men departed, musicians still speak of that night in reverent whispers. The jam session, when barrier-breaking elegance met boundary-destroying wildness, and neither blinked. Sammy Davis Jr. proved dignity could coexist with defiance, that opening doors for yourself meant holding them for those behind you, that true kings crowned their successors. The guitar his father clutched in Jim Crow America, that he polished in the Rat Pack's golden age, that Jimmy wielded like lightning, it sang the same song across generations. We are here, we are undeniable, and our music will outlive every system built to silence us. What legacy are you passing forward to the next generation? Subscribe to witness more untold stories that changed music forever.